of all, welcome all of you to the stage here, and appreciate you joining late in the afternoon here. It's we feel good about this time slot because we know those who are here really want to be here, right? But I'm grateful to be back amongst such a distinguished group of individuals and to be participating in this conference. So I want to welcome our panelists to the stage here, and actually I'm just going to have them go from my right to the left and just have them do a quick introduction of themselves. Everybody has a mic, okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kathleen Weron. I'm an employment law attorney management side. I work with Ogletree Deacons, and we're a global law firm that only deals with employment issues. And I say only employment issues because that's absolutely everything in your organizations, from immigration to executive compensation and all of the federal and state statutes. So we're here in Utah, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for being here with us.
Hi,
Susan?
I'm Susan Oliver. I am an executive search consultant. I've been in the life sciences industry with executive search for about 20 plus years. I've worked with many of the biggest executive search firms in the world, and made a decision about 6 months ago to not work for the biggest executive search firms in the world. Hence my firm, Oliver Life Sciences Search, and I'm super excited to be here.
Great, thank you.
Yes, no, I don't want to do that. Is that better? Oh, I sound real good like that. Could we do karaoke instead?
So you have to repeat everything. Okay, all right, very good. Stephanie?
I was going to say, we'll see if everybody else can repeat it and see if they've been paying attention. So thank you, everybody. My name is Stephanie Lyon. So prior to working at Stratus.HR, and I'm a business development consultant, I worked for a large corporate retailer on the front lines, a company that didn't have internal HR, and we were HR. If things went wrong, it went to legal. But what I do professionally now, I work with leaders in human resources, workers' comp, risk management, employee benefits, and payroll administration. And really, we help put an HR foundation in place, so one day, should they need to hire an HR professional, that person is successful, and really it gets business owners back to doing what they do best.
That's great. Well, thanks all for your introduction. Obviously, we have a very esteemed group up here that's experts in their space, and we're going to get right into the questions. So as you know, this the title of this panel is called How to Avoid Hiring Mistakes. So our first question to the panelists is simply going to be, what mistakes are there and how can you avoid making them, right? So that's my first question. I'll go to Stephanie for a first response.
So the biggest mistake that I see people not having an HR infrastructure in place. So the last panel that was speaking about services, they talked a lot about a neighbor, coming in and doing the bookkeeping and the CFO work. I see a lot of that in HR. Usually it's a second thought. We can't afford it. I hear people say, I don't need HR. Unbeknownst to them, they're already doing HR. So really, it's a secondary thought of having a process and a structure, so that way when they hire a person, they can be successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. Susan?
So my answer is with a caveat. Everything I say except it doesn't apply to HR, Stephanie. One of the most common mistakes I see, particularly small entrepreneurs make in hiring, is too much too soon. So filling out that C-suite because you feel compelled to have a chief medical officer, a chief operating officer, a chief scientific officer, and all of a sudden you've burned through your entire seed round with positions you don't need and you can't afford. So instead of focusing on the fundamental skills you're looking for, you focused on a role that you thought you should fill. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the biggest mistake I see early on. Yeah. Except HR, Stephanie.
So let me ask a follow-up question then, Susan. Do you feel like that pressure to hire the C-suite, do you think that's coming, I'll just ask you, where is that coming from? Where is that pressure coming from for early stage companies?
So one of two places. Either people just feel like that's how it should be, or you're ego-driven to fill out your most immediate team. But David Perry talked about this morning in the keynote, and he mentioned specifically he did not hire a full-time CFO. I think it was one other position, and it was either legal or something else, but there were two very senior positions that he kept on contract because he didn't need it full-time and he knew he couldn't afford it.
Okay, that's great insight. Thank you. Kathleen?
I think my response really incorporates both of your responses. I think when you're making hiring decisions, part of that infrastructure that you should have in place, and I would encourage you to have, is have thought through your org chart. Doesn't matter if it's a first draft or the 100th draft. Have that org chart in place, and then for legal reasons, later down the road, it's really important to think through the job descriptions. So, and probably the least fun thing that you can be doing is putting together a job description. But if you're going to interview and hire for that position, you should have thought through what is that position, what are the duties, what are the reporting, what are the physical requirements of this position, and where does it fit into the overall org chart. So I would have those two things as part of my infrastructure that's in place.
That's great. And obviously writing, for those of you, I think everybody in this room has written a job description at some point or another, right? Pretty tedious work. So, no? We got one head shake up here. All right. I'm going to hire you for my team. All right. No, but my question is, what resources are available to early stage companies like for things like a job description, right? Like, do they have to just sit down and stare at a blank Word document and just start, okay, these are the duties that they'll do? Like, what kind of resources are available to help them with job descriptions?
I usually advise my clients that there is a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Blank wall staring, being thoughtful about what is this position and what are the duties. And if you're in a small organization, there are going to be a lot of different hats that you wear. But to spend that painfully boring time thinking through that, and then connect with the other people in your organization about that. If you have somebody who's already doing that job, ask them what they're doing. What do you do on a daily basis? What would you say are the deliverables and the metrics of this job? What would you like to see this job maybe expand into or not expand into? So I think there is that process of really being thoughtful about it on your own, and then collaborating with either somebody who's already doing that job, and it might be you, but whoever is doing that job, to think through that job. And then does it make sense, all those duties and those tasks, to be in this job description? Maybe that's a separate job description, and maybe that's somebody that you contract with. But to think through that before you just, we got to get warm bodies in here, because I think that's where mistakes are made, and then it's much harder to shift once people are there, once they're doing that job. So you get out in front of that, and it does unfortunately involve a little bit of the staring at a blank wall, thinking through it.
Yeah, okay, great. Any other follow-up comments to that, either Susan or Stephanie?
So, and you're all going to be a little bit surprised by this, but I'm totally serious. ChatGPT. Start there.
Yeah.
Let something that's very, very broad give you a template. You're always going to tweak it, because that first 3 paragraphs is your job description is all about the organization, what you are. So it's going to get very specific from that standpoint. Then you're going to get some broad strokes. So, for example, you're vice president of procurement for disease state plasma. It's very specific. It's not going to have a lot of variation, but procurement's kind of procurement. So you're going to take someone else's very broad descriptions or Google's broad descriptions. And it's interesting because we're all going to do that anyway. You're going to mine other sources and resources for what are the things I should really be looking for in this position description. That's going to generate that template for you. And I would absolutely recommend using that as a basis. I'm using it with my clients now with their full knowledge. But then again, 90% of my clients are using ChatGPT to write their emails.
Yeah, that's a great
So
resource.
there is sort of this embrace of what this is and what it's going to be.
Great, love that, love that. Anything else on that topic about help in writing job descriptions?
I mean, there absolutely spot on as far as making sure that it really is in line with what the person's doing. There's resources. I mean, a lot of people are using AI resources. I would say if it's an early stage company, you know, aside from just the position description, just having that candid conversation that this is your position, but there's going to need to be a nimbleness to that position because you're less rigid when it's a startup company. So part of the position description, you know, part of one of the things that you can't be is the person that says, this isn't my job.
Right. That's great. Well, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit here onto a different topic and get away from, and we'll probably talk more about kind of hiring mistakes as we go through the process. I'm sure we'll continue to touch on that piece of it, but I'm interested in the topic of sourcing. So we think about getting talent into our respective organizations, right? The sourcing piece is really about how we identify talent that is on the very early end. So there's proactive sourcing and there's reactive sourcing. So talk to me a little bit about the advice you would give in terms of how to source the right talent.
I'd leverage your internal network very first. And that's the people who work in your company today, and that might be 4 of you sitting around the board table, the conference room table, and having that conversation. When you get a little bit bigger, so there are 8 or 12 of you, I would actually incent that. So the first 3 or 4 of you who are founders and early in the organization, you're already incented to leverage your network. But then I would financially incent staff to leverage their own resources, especially because they're already experts in both what you do and what they do. That would be the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is I'd leverage social media. Everyone, and we all know this over the last 3 or 4 years, every company has got to have a social media presence. And I'm not talking about sort of Facebook or Instagram, but if you take a look at what we were doing with LinkedIn 10 years ago and what we're doing with LinkedIn today, it is phenomenally, dramatically different, and you're gonna have to have a presence there. And with rare exception, everyone will, in fact, use that as part of their recruiting strategy. So you go post your jobs there, and it's relatively inexpensive to do that. That would be the second thing I would do. When you have exhausted that, and depending on how technical you need that position to be, then you come to a third party. So if it is a challenging technical position, it's really scientific, it's your VP of translational medicine and you're doing immuno-oncology, yeah, you probably do want to step out of that network when it's been exhausted and come to those of us who have been doing it for a really long time, and that depth of knowledge is pretty deep.
Okay. Other thoughts, Stephanie or Kathleen?
So I was having a conversation earlier in the hall with one of the companies, and I thought it was interesting. They were talking about attracting talent by the internal workplace and making that an attractive space to have somebody come and work, which made me think a lot about employer brand, right? Aside from the standard things that they should be doing, position descriptions, word of mouth, hiring a recruiter, really building yourself as an employer of choice that somebody wants to work for, and then you shouldn't hopefully have to work so hard to find that talent.
Yeah, I really like that piece you mentioned about establishing yourself as an employer of choice, right? In some circles, you probably hear of employee value proposition, right? So what's the value proposition that a company has as they go out and source talent, right? So have you guys worked with any companies on developing an employee value proposition, and what sort of elements should be part of that thought process?
I'll jump in here.
Yeah.
So as far as the proposition,
Yeah.
So I think of companies that you go in and like you see words on a wall, right? I think that when you're looking to build a proposition, you're really looking to build a culture. With that, you're looking to practice that culture. And I think where people don't get it wrong and where we go in and we advise is that you have to make sure that that's an everyday practice, a monthly practice. So just for example, internally, we created what we call Stratus.HR DNA. average tenure, 9 years. People worked there for 20 years. What has made up, those individuals that work for the company? These are the attributes. So we use those attributes when we do Employee of the Month. We use those attributes when we hire. We also use those attributes when we look to work with clients. So as we look to help them build a culture like our culture, we take that experience and that we do internally and help them create a similar framework.
I like that. Stephanie. Thank you. Still on this topic of sourcing, right? We're talking about how do we get talent into our organization? How do we find them? We're Utah, right? Many of us are Utah-based companies. Let's talk a little bit about geographically dispersed workforce, right? So how broad of a net should early stage companies be casting in terms of where their employees are located?
There are some important cost considerations from a legal standpoint that I think you need to take into consideration because the states are vastly different. So we have federal statutes and federal law that governs all of the states, but then individual states can create their own laws that can be wildly different. Colorado, just our neighbor to the east, is the complete opposite of Utah. So you're not going to be able to have a one-size-fits-all handbook or policies regarding employees. If you allow, maybe you have one employee in Colorado, one in California, one in New Jersey, and 10 in Utah, you're going to need to have a legal compliance review of your policies because those states are so vastly different. So that's one thing that I would take into consideration from a legal standpoint. The more states you're in, the more regulation and state laws that you're going to need to know and comply with.
Excellent point. Other thoughts about a geographically dispersed workforce?
10 years ago, the comment we heard most frequently from executives who did not want to relocate for a new opportunity was, I have kids in high school, and I've made a commitment not to move them. And inevitably, and this is 5, 6, 7 years ago, they didn't progress forward in the process because we were pretty committed, corporate America, to everybody's going to be on site. I think that there has been a dramatic shift, not exclusively caused by COVID. It's if you want the best talent, you cannot have that as a primary restriction, even though it might be highly desirable for a company both to create a culture that is consistent across maybe not just the US, but around the world. Having everyone in the same place at the same time is pretty valuable to that, but it is not impossible to do it otherwise. And I think we saw that certainly shift before COVID, and it's definitely maintained that after COVID. There is a large pharmaceutical company in Indianapolis, who I will not mention, in Indianapolis, and for the entirety of their being as an entity, until about the last 5 years, everyone had to be on site. It was painful for them to open an immuno-oncology hub in Manhattan. They didn't want to do it, but they could not attract clinical development teams to Indianapolis. So they did it, but you had to so if you're sitting in Princeton and you're working for this organization, you are taking that train every day in and out of Manhattan. It became, and that was a struggle. So even though we had the opportunity to recruit to that hub and not into Indiana, it was still challenging from that standpoint. Fast forward 24 months, ago, and that maybe it's been 3 years, that company makes an acquisition. And all of a sudden, overnight, the entire oncology organization is managed by someone else whose teams are in San Diego, San Francisco, Seattle, Paris, Connecticut. And thus the era of, we don't have to work on site begins for that organization. And it was, on one hand, kind of a culture shock for the whole organization, and there was a bit of that if they get to work from home, why can't I work from home? So a little bit of that from a legal standpoint, but they were so excited about feeling like they were coming into a new era that most of the staff embraced that pretty wildly in a good way.
So it sounds like in talking about a geographically dispersed workforce, there's some trade-offs. There's some legal implications, some cost implications, culture implications. On the negative side, there's also some positives in terms of getting talent that you need where you need them. Any other positives or negatives from, considering, should I hire that person who may be in, let's say, Boston? I mean, Boston tends to be a hub, right? We have a lot of talent that's there, and sometimes people want to remain in Boston, right? So any other positives or negatives about having someone working remote like that?
The executive in Boston's going to want to relocate to Salt Lake.
What's that?
The executive in Boston's going to want to relocate to
yeah,
Salt Lake. I mean, they like it,
Yeah.
but this is an attractive geography.
Yeah, I find that maybe you guys will validate this, that once people get here, there's always barriers about, like, I don't really want to go to Utah, but once they get here, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I lived anywhere else, right? So I don't know if that's, you guys, do you see that dynamic in the talent that you recruit here? I'm seeing heads nod, so I would say so.
Sure.
Okay. And what do you tend to find that helps people get over that as you're looking to recruit talent? Let's say that we don't want somebody remote, we want them here. What do you find, what's sort of that, call it a sales pitch, that helps them to get here?
Cost of living.
Yeah. Others?
The outdoors sells itself. I mean, the ability to be on a hike after work, or all of the 5 national parks. I think people get here and realize it's a really nice lifestyle.
Yeah. Great points. All right, going to shift gears away from sourcing and go to a next series of questions, which is a little bit about this dynamic of when you have people that are you're developing a team, and we talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of you're establishing your leadership team, a tendency to hire individuals at a very senior level, right? And so compensation obviously comes into play there, right? So what are some of the compensation related things that startups should be thinking about, or early stage companies be thinking about in terms of recruitment of executive C-suites, but also rank and file employees as well? What kinds of dynamics are you seeing with compensation?
About 5 or 6 years ago, and you probably have a better handle on the date than I do, when the state of New York and its surrounding states started passing legislation precluding certainly third-party recruiters and absolutely companies from asking what a candidate's current compensation is. We thought that would hamstring us a great deal. And both of the companies I have worked for in the last 5 or 6 years, we made a decision as an organization to not ask anyone their current compensation regardless of what state they lived in. It was going to be too much to determine who was in what headquarters, and if it was a business unit in Tempe recruiting a candidate in San Diego, did we have to live by that regulation? So we just made a decision not to do that. However, and by the way, statistically, it did not close any wage gaps, any of that legislation, and that's just a side note. But from a compensation standpoint, I think particularly the C-suite, you need to have a pretty good understanding of what that's going to cost your budget, and not just from that salary standpoint, but all of the fringe and what you're going to need to do for equity parity, and depending on what the founding situation is like, and then you go to experts to determine what that looks like. And then I think we've seen a lot of conversation during the day, particularly in the finance conversations this morning, about the value of rewarding people who help you build your business and pushing that equity into your organization as much as you possibly can without creating a situation on your funding side, whether that's venture capital or other private markets. So it's parity, I think, is one of the most critical things. And then I'm going to say this: do not, and this, I have validated this, do not undercompensate compared to the market. The short-term value will not make up for your long-term pain when you do that. There's so many examples I can give where I have encouraged a client to not do their own compensation negotiations with a candidate and to not nickel and dime the candidate to death. Two things happen. Your candidate walks in a little bitter, and you've had sort of no third part, right? If they're doing the negotiations on their own, that really doesn't go very well very often. And if you undercompensate compared to the market, the second that person ticks off 3 years on their resume, they will take my call.
Now, as a follow-up to that, you mentioned this dynamic where, with pay equity, right, asking a candidate, like, what's your current compensation, right? Very common question we used to ask 5 years ago, really to every candidate. So how do you then determine, without asking them where they're currently at, how do you determine how to make a competitive offer to that candidate? You may know what the market is, but you may not know what that candidate wants or expects. So how do you get that information so that when you present an offer, you're confident in how it's positioned in the market, but you're also confident it's going to resonate with that candidate? Thoughts on that? Stephanie, I'll ask you for that one.
So there's tools out there that you can look at pay. One of them, pay scale, right? You can see a high, a medium, and a low on where that person should be sitting compensation-wise, as well as benefits that should be offered. I think that that's always a really good starting point. And then knowing what your budget is, to be able to pay that person. I think that you had touched on, giving them some type of equity. If you know you have to pay on the lower end, however, we are giving you this, I think you just have to have that open conversation. And if they come back and say, hey, I really need to be at this pay, then you can get into a negotiation with pay. And then each individual can decide if they can reach a negotiation that's acceptable, both walk away feeling good about it, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my recommendation with it. Know exactly where that position in that respective area, what it pays.
Okay.
I would bet 9 out of 10, particularly senior executives, will tell me what their compensation is in the first 20 minutes of a conversation. And it's a volunteered, because they don't want to look at roles for which the compensation isn't adequate or would reflect that the position isn't broad enough or large enough for that individual. So with rare exception, do I not have that information? And they're always willing for me to share that with a client. So then it becomes, did the client budget appropriately? Is the position spec'd correctly? And if any of those things are out of alignment, then we kind of figure it out in that first maybe 2 or 3 weeks of a recruiting cycle. I'm working with a client now who 4 years ago was dramatically under market on a chief commercial officer project. We could recruit out of the United States or out of Europe. We ended up taking this executive out of Europe because we were literally a third higher than the European executives doing essentially the same role. So we did that. Fast forward, remember I told you about how he underpaid? That executive resigned. We were doing the search. They now want a U.S. executive chief commercial officer. They will absolutely have to pay that third more this time to get that there. We've got some awareness of that, but you also have, it's not just this market you have to analyze, but what you're really doing globally.
Yeah, great point. Kathleen, you had something to share there.
I do a lot of executive compensation plans, and I think Stephanie's right. Sometimes if the salary's lower, they might want different equity rights, and that's to be considered. But there are also other considerations, sometimes a lesser period of a non-compete, or a severance package, or severance if there is a non-compete in the event that they're terminated. Or so there's some options that you can put in the executive agreement as well that's not necessarily compensation based, but provides some security in the event of termination or a buyout or severance packages that you can negotiate in advance.
Okay. Great, great points. And before I leave the topic of compensation, is there anything else? This dialogue is about pitfalls, right? And compensation can be one of those really big pitfalls with recruiting talent. Anything else that, I'm sure there's probably questions about compensation from the room here, but anything else before I move on to another series of questions?
I would
Yeah.
say think carefully about whether you're going to put your executives in an executive contract with a term of years or whether you're going to keep them at will. We're going to talk about at will at the end.
Okay.
And
Should we just go there since we're on the topic? So why don't you explain, Kathleen? You're an attorney, so at will. Let's describe what that is and why that's important, or why it's not important.
it's very important. At will employment means that you, as the employer, as well as the employee, can separate employment for any reason or no reason at all. That allows you to terminate without notice. And you don't have to provide any payment, any compensation other than the wages that are already owed. The presumption in Utah is that an employee is at will. That presumption, however, can be rebutted by the employer. So if you put, for example, your CEO into a term of years for 3 years, you now have a contract. You no longer have at will employment. And typically those contracts say, I'm contracting with you for 3 years, you're going to be my CEO, you're not going to leave, and I'm not going to fire you for 3 years. So you're already boxed in. Now, obviously, there are ways out. If there are ways out, you can leave for good reason, so you can resign as my CEO, but only if you have good reason. And I can terminate you for cause, and then your severance benefits will depend on whether or not, if you leave without good reason, you don't get severance. If I terminate you without cause, you don't get severance. Or excuse me, terminate you with cause, then you don't get severance. So there are reasons that you may want to bind yourself to a contract and not take advantage of the at-will presumption, but think through that very carefully. There are very, very few reasons to do that, and they should be thought through carefully before you just slap a contract on anyone. You can still have an executive agreement that's at will, that preserves the at-will relationship. So you can have a contract with your well, it's not a contract for a term, but there are other terms in there other than how long you're going to be employed or why you can leave. So you preserve the at-will relationship in the agreement, but it might set forth the equity, the vesting schedule, and those sorts of things in the agreement. But at-will employment allows the employer to make a decision and terminate somebody with or without cause, with or without notice, for any reason or no reason at all. So you want that freedom. Obviously, it can't be a discriminatory reason or an unlawful reason, but that freedom to be able to make decisions. When a relationship goes south, it usually goes south quickly, and if you're stuck in a 3-year contract or have to negotiate contract terms, it's never pretty, and there are usually lawyers who get involved, and then it's the lawyers fighting over terms. So preserve your at-will relationship. If you're not going to, think about why you're not going to. There should be a very specific purpose that it's trying to serve.
Okay, great, thank you. And then speaking of the contracts, right, or employment agreements, what are some other things? You know, you hear about these non-competes. So should startup companies, should they have non-competes in there for their employees? Should they leave it out? Is it enforceable? Are there other things in the employment agreement that you think should either be in there or left out?
You should have for a confidentiality agreement, and then restrictive covenants, which could include a non-compete, non-solicitation of customers, non-solicitation of employees, and then in inventions and assignments an agreement. And those can usually be one agreement with different headings. Now, on the issue of non-competes, they're very hot topic right now. The FTC in April of 2023 said that they were going to make a rule to ban non-competes across the country, across the board.
In California.
That rule is going to come out in about 3 weeks. And my bet is the FTC is going to ban non-competes, and everybody's going to freak out and read the headlines and say non-competes are not lawful. That will, if that is the case, that the FTC comes out in 4 weeks and says that non-competes are banned, it will be immediately litigated. So just like in the same way that the ETS that OSHA came out and said everybody has to be vaccinated was challenged because they don't have that authority, that this will be challenged. So just be forewarned, you'll see that.
Have we seen the challenge in California, though? Because they've had a virtual ban on non-competes
That
for
was
years.
a legislative ban. This is a executive agency, the FTC, banning it. So it'll be challenged that they don't have that
opposed to
authority as an executive branch. That's probably going to be the challenge. But so that's the first issue, is that we're probably going to hear in about a month that they're banned, but sit tight. They're not, because that'll be challenged. Now, with that being said, certain states have banned them. California is one. Colorado is another. New York, their legislature introduced legislation that was vetoed by the government. They're likely to ban it. There's about 26 states that have either banned or have severe restrictions on non-competes. So a salary component, for example, you can't ask somebody who isn't meeting a certain statutory threshold to sign a non-compete. So if you are thinking about non-competes, and there's a time and a place for non-competes, and you want to use them so that you're protecting a legitimate business interest. If you slap a non-compete on everybody, including the receptionist, that's not a legitimate business interest. If it's challenged, that's going to hurt you. But your chief scientist, your CEO, your head of sales, those kinds of individuals who have access to information, who you are maybe going to bring up through the ranks and teach about what you're doing, and you want to preserve that. Those people who have relationships, like in the instance of a sales manager, or you can have a non-compete in the state of Utah. You can't in Colorado. So think through, again, if you've got a remote workforce, that's another one of the considerations that you have to think through. Can that person be under a non-compete? In Utah, you can have a non-compete. It's for a period of 12 months following separation of employment. If it meets a legitimate business interest and is reasonable in geographic scope, it's enforceable. And so are non-solicitation clauses. Non-solicitation clauses can be in perpetuity. They are not limited by time period. So you can say, if you work for me and you leave, you can never solicit employees. You can never solicit any of the customers that you had contact with. But non-solicitation clauses in some states are coming under scrutiny as well. Montana's one of them. They've said no non-solicitation clause. It's anti-competitive behavior. Employees should be able to be solicited. Customers should be able to be solicited. So you'll want to look at that. The only thing that seems to be safe right now are your confidentiality agreements. You can't take our confidential information, and you should have a confidentiality agreement, because if somebody leaves and they take your trade secrets and you pursue them with trade secret litigation, first thing it's going to be say is, well, what did you do to protect your information? You didn't have any confidentiality agreements. You didn't have any policies.
That's a great point.
So, yeah, that we could spend the next hour talking about that. And an inventions assignment agreement as well. Those are safe. And non-competes and non-solicitation restrictive covenants depends upon where you have your employees. And it's typically the state where they're employed, not that you're headquartered in Utah.
Fantastic. That's great legal advice. Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of time. I want to make sure that we open it up for questions to the room here. We've got one back here. Kelvin, should I run the mic down, or you just?
I'm loud enough.
You're loud enough. Okay.
So, question for Stephanie, since you mentioned pay scale, high, medium, and low range of payments for CISO, which is kind of meaningless because what is low for 10 billion company is high for 1 billion company. Do you know of any resource that separates compensation scale depending on the company valuation?
So there's other resources other than pay scale, but typically when you're doing a search, they look at the number of employees, they look at the industry, so you are focusing in on doing an apples to apples look at pay. Does that answer your question?
Can you mention Radford? You said?
Radford.
Radford, okay, thank you.
And I don't know if does BioSpace break it down by company size? And BioSpace is free and Radford is not. But BioSpace may also break it down by company size, and they do, theirs is annual survey driven, so individuals choose to participate in BioSpaces, but I find it to be pretty accurate. And, you know, going one step further, an informal salary survey. So call somebody you know and trust, and there are those of us who are happy to help executives even sort of figure that out as just part of goodwill. You could make a call to a trusted third-party search partner and say, what does this pay for an organization of my size and at this valuation, and this is what I need. We are so happy to help you do that.
Great. Maybe one more question. Got your hand up back here.
Yes, so it's less of a question and more of comments on some of the things you said really quick. So going to the employer brand, I think that is so important these days when you have things like Glassdoor and other types of outlets for employees to talk about those types of things. And I've just seen a lot of discussion around that, and it does really go to being able to attract the kind of talent you want. Second is the compensation comment. I believe, Susan, you were talking about this where, you know, people are paying too little or nickel and diming. I'm an attorney and I've seen a lot of downward pressure on the general counsel salaries lately.
Sure.
And so they're hiring general counsels that are like 10 years out. And so you're getting what you paid for.
Could not agree more. And let me add one component to what Stephanie said about the company brand. That's all fantastic. About a month ago, as I agreed to sit on this panel this afternoon, I called 5, 6, 7 of my closest CHRO buddies and said, hey, what do you think about this topic? And give me your opinion. And 3 of the 5 of them made this specific comment, which is, do not have smoke and mirrors as part of your recruiting process. Be candid with the people you are recruiting. Good, bad, ugly, right? Everybody has an ugly baby in their organization, and it could be your technology, it could be your general counsel, it could, whatever that is, you need to be as transparent as you possibly can, and then use that transparency and candidness as part of your, and this is part of our culture, and why the reasons why you should join us still remain, and give them those 3 reasons. If you are not transparent, and I cannot tell you, and anybody who interviews, especially on the outside of an organization, will have a candidate say to you, I can't believe I'm going to tell you this, but I got there and then there will be a litany. And it might be big and it might be little. But when, you know, the big is I'm the VP of sales, and the chief commercial officer said our commission was going to be 40%, and we just got an email last week and it's 0. Don't make that mistake.
That's great advice. And I saw that there were a couple of other hands up. We'll be around after this session, but we do need to wrap this up and get into the main session here. But I want to first of all thank all of you for participating, and particularly thank our panelists here, Kathleen, Susan, and Stephanie. We really appreciate the time and the preparation you put into this and sharing these insights today. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.